Hello, I'm Harry Laforme. In 1492, Christopher Columbus stumbled upon North America believing it was India. And while that meant that the indigenous people would be forever called Indians, the fact that it was the wrong place meant nothing, because on that occasion, Columbus was on a mission for the Catholic Church. You see, in 1453, the Pope, through papal bulls, granted Christian nations authority to claim and conquer lands with instructions to redraw the ranks of power. Christian kings were to discover and colonize new lands, heathen lands. They were to search out and subdue all pagans and other enemies of Christ and reduce them to perpetual slavery for the monarch's use and profit. Thus began the campaign of the doctrine of discovery, the colonization of lands around the world through the magic of papal bulls. So when Columbus stuck the flag of Spain into the soil of North America, magic seeped into and spread throughout all the land, and not just for Spain. For the next 400 years, the magic lay dormant in North America, although nations continued to spread it elsewhere. The French and English in the 1500s settled the northern parts of North America, the magic of the discovery doctrine virtually unknown to them. Their only concern was survival in a harsh, undeveloped new land and many fierce indigenous inhabitants. Alliances were quickly formed as trade and commerce developed with the Indians, and I use that word in memory of Columbus. It was also necessary because Indians outnumbered the colonists who, even so, taught them how to survive in the brutal land. The Indians provided them with new medicines and introduced them to new foods. Together, they began Thanksgiving. Descriptions of their Indian allies reflected respect and admiration. Later, the British and French engaged in hostilities with each other over trade routes. Alliances with Indians was necessary for help. In the 1600s, these alliances were confirmed in treaties. The treaties were of respect for the dignity and integrity of two nations, stressing non-interference with the other. In 1763, the British asserted authority around the Great Lakes, ignoring its alliance and treaty relations with the Indians. The Indians attacked them and stopped their efforts for control. However, this was not meant to run the British out. It was to restore the terms of the alliance. The Indians wanted a partner, not a ruler. The attack was the message. King George III accepted the mistake and restored the terms of alliance in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It recognized the several nations or tribes of Indians and assured them, at a time when they were still a military force, that their rights would be better protected by assistance from the Crown than by self-help. After the proclamation and into the mid-1800s, many peace and friendship treaties were made between the Crown and the Indians. The colonists knew the Indians governed themselves by their own laws and customs and saw them as allies. The magic of the papal bulls and its doctrine of discovery remained dormant, but things change. By the mid-1800s in Canada, the Indian population was severely reduced by foreign diseases brought by colonists. They were no longer feared and were needless for military alliance, trade, or other economic development. Indians were an obstacle to the colonists' new priority, economic development and the construction of a cross-country railroad. Indian lands were needed, not Indians. As part of this colonial shift, magic so necessary in the papal bulls was conjured: language. Colonists classified themselves as civilized and Indians as savages. As savages, Indians were at the bottom of the human development. They were now described as ignorant and superstitious, in need of emancipation and elevation from their condition of savagery and helplessness by enlightened colonists. The language was that of papal bulls from 400 years ago. From this institutionalized bias, images, policies, and legislation could now legitimately evolve. Indians, as inferior beings, could rightly be set apart on reserves. And so it went. Indians were reduced from equal founding partners to crown wards. In all aspects, diminished in capacity, the colonial government assumed total responsibility for their care and needs. The Crown was their legal guardian with all legal authority for them. In 1867, the British North America Act created Canada. The powers of government were divided between the provinces and federal government. Indians and their lands were federal. Federal Parliament could now continue the colonial policy and legally define the identity of its Crown wards, as well as all their rights and interests. In 1876, it did this through the first Indian Act, which became the central tool for giving itself the authority to entirely manage the lives of Indians, creating hundreds of thousands of wards of the federal state. Also, government now saw treaties as simple contracts with minimum requirements. But still the question, what about Indian land? Well, now comes the rediscovery of the papal bull's magic and the reawakening of its malignancy. In the 1880s, a dispute arose between Ontario and Canada over who owned the lands of Indians who had purportedly surrendered them. As this dispute engaged the Canadian courts, the United States was looked to for help. In this, they learned of the magic of the papal bulls and its doctrine of discovery. As it happened, in the early 1800s in the United States, a dispute arose because a man purchased land from an Indian nation. And later, another man purchased it from the United States government. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court conjured the magic of the papal bulls and decided that when the British discovered the lands in the United States, they had acquired actual title to them. Consequently, the court said, the Indians never had any title to land. They had no land to sell. Canada liked that analysis. So in 1888, Canada's courts decided that any interest in its lands, such as it might be, was limited to that of use and occupation only. It was certainly not, and never had been, ownership, and Indian use and occupation was at the pleasure of the Crown. It could be taken away at any time. The malignancy of the magic of the papal bulls had moved north. So, through this magical law, the conquest of the Indians of Canada was complete. Who can be an Indian, where and how they can live, and the ownership of their original lands were now in the complete possession and control of the colonists. Indians were landless, disenfranchised, and relegated to the status of wards of the state, reduced to a lesser class of Canadian. And because Canada is a nation founded on the rule of law, law confirmed it all to be lawful. All of this is still the law in Canada. Through a papal bull, a type of charter issued by a pope, not a law itself, whose use was magically transformed into a legal doctrine that is now universally recognized as a legal fiction, just as the racist and dehumanizing language used to invest it with its power is recognized as a vile fiction, was how we Indians were conquered by law, a conquest through magic. Miigwech, thank you.